Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back to the deep dive. This time, we're tackling a really important topic, the history of Indigenous civil rights in the U.S. and Canada. And you sent over a really interesting mix of sources for this deep dive history podcast, some actual court case summaries. It's awesome. So it seems like we'll be exploring the question, how did Indigenous communities, despite facing all these pressures to assimilate, you know, pressures to just blend in, how did they manage to not only protect their cultures, but actually fight for their rights and self-determination?
Yeah. And what I think is so fascinating is how these movements, both in the U.S. and Canada, have evolved over time, leading to these landmark legal victories, but also raising questions about, the challenges that still remain. It's a complex story. And at times, kind of a heartbreaking story, but one that's,
Definitely. Let's start with the early 20th century. Just reading through these sources, it's clear that this was a period of intense pressure on Indigenous communities, we're talking, forced assimilation, land dispossession, things like the U.S. boarding schools and the Canadian residential schools, which they're just gut-wrenching to read about. Kids were literally taken from their families and forced to abandon their language and their culture.
Yeah, it was a systematic attempt to just erase Indigenous cultures. And the podcast actually quotes a government official from this era as saying, "Kill the Indian, save the man."
Yeah.
Which is pretty disturbing stuff. A lot of the sources use the term cultural genocide to describe this period. And when you look at the policies, it's hard to argue with that.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, how did Indigenous communities even begin to push back against such overwhelming forces?
Well, despite the brutality of these assimilation policies, Indigenous people never stopped resisting. They found ways to maintain their traditions in secret, to pass down their languages, to keep their cultures alive.
Right.
It wasn't until the mid-20th century that we see a real shift towards organized political action.
Right. And it seems like the 1930s brought a glimmer of hope in the U.S. with the Indian Reorganization Act.
Exactly. The IRA marked a pretty major turning point. I mean, for the first time, the U.S. government acknowledged the importance of preserving Native American cultures and actually encouraged tribal self-governance, albeit with limitations. It wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
But it did provide some federal funding and allowed for the creation of tribal constitutions and governments.
It wasn't a complete reversal of the assimilation policies, but it was a step in a different direction.
Yeah. And it's important to understand that the IRA had a mixed legacy. Some tribes embraced it and used it to strengthen their sovereignty, while others felt that it was still too paternalistic and didn't really go far enough in restoring their rights. But it did lay the groundwork for the more assertive activism that would emerge later.
Then after World War II, things really start to heat up, especially with the rise of groups like the American Indian Movement and the National Indian Youth Council. These sources paint them as pretty radical compared to what came before.
Yeah. They were definitely more confrontational, inspired by the civil rights movement. These groups adopted a much more assertive approach, staging protests, occupying government buildings, and demanding that treaty rights be honored.
AIM's occupation of Alcatraz Island in 1969 is probably the most famous example of that. What were they trying to achieve with that?
It was a brilliant piece of political theater. By occupying Alcatraz, which they argued was rightfully theirs under an old treaty, AAM brought international attention to the plight of Native Americans. They demanded the return to the island, better living conditions, and an end to discrimination.
Even though they didn't get the island back, the occupation was a huge turning point. It galvanized Native American activism and forced the U.S. government to take their demands more seriously.
Even if it wasn't a legal victory, it was a PR win.
Exactly. It shifted the conversation and showed the world that, Native Americans were not going to be silent anymore. And it paved the way for some pretty major legal victories in the years to come.
Now, what about Canada? The sources mentioned Trudeau's white paper in 1969, which seems like it was heading in the complete opposite direction of the IRA. Yeah. The white paper aimed to fully assimilate Indigenous peoples to Canadian society by getting rid of the Indian Act and eliminating reserves. The idea was to treat Indigenous people the same as all other Canadians. But Indigenous groups saw this as yet another attempt to erase their unique identities and their treaty rights. And so, it sparked huge protests and actually led to a resurgence of Indigenous activism.
So it kind of backfired.
Completely. It galvanized Indigenous communities across Canada. Groups like the National Indian Brotherhood mobilized to fight the white paper, arguing that true equality meant recognizing their distinct rights and cultures, not forcing them to assimilate. Eventually, the government was forced to withdraw the white paper.
Wow. So both in the US and Canada, you see this rise of activism and this rejection of forced assimilation. It makes you wonder, what lasting changes did these movements achieve? It feels like we're reaching a real turning point here. You have all this activism pushing for recognition of Indigenous rights.
Right.
But did it actually lead to any legal changes?
Oh, absolutely. The late 20th century saw some landmark court cases that really reshaped the legal landscape for Indigenous rights in both the U.S. and Canada.
The sources highlight cases like U.S. v. Wheeler and Calder v. British Columbia. I have to admit, I'm not really a legal scholar. Can you break those down for us?
Yeah, of course. So in the U.S., U.S. v. Wheeler was a game changer because it affirmed the inherent sovereignty of tribes, basically. The Supreme Court said that tribes have these inherent powers of self-government that predate the United States and aren't simply granted by the federal government. This is huge because it meant that tribes had a right to govern themselves, independent of state or federal interference, at least to a certain extent.
Okay, so that sounds like a major win for tribal sovereignty. What about the Calder case in Canada?
Calder v. British Columbia was equally significant for Canada in that case. The Supreme Court of Canada recognized Aboriginal title for the first time. Aboriginal title is basically the legal recognition that Indigenous peoples have rights to their traditional lands. And these rights stem from their occupation and use of those lands before European contact.
So it's acknowledging that Indigenous land rights existed before Canada even existed as a country.
Exactly. And the Calder case.
Yeah.
Even though it didn't grant specific land rights, in that particular instance, it opened the door for future land claims and negotiations. It basically said, yes, Aboriginal title exists in Canadian law, which was a huge legal victory for Indigenous peoples.
That's amazing. So did these legal decisions actually lead to real change on the ground? Did tribes start getting their land back?
Well, it's complicated. These cases definitely created a legal framework for recognizing and negotiating Indigenous rights. But the process has been slow and often fraught with challenges. In the U.S., tribes have been able to use the Wheeler decision to assert greater control over their internal affairs. But they still face limitations on their sovereignty imposed by the federal government.
And in Canada, the recognition of Aboriginal title has led to some land claims being settled.
Right.
I remember reading about the Nisga'a Treaty.
You're right. The Nisga'a Treaty, signed in 2000, was a landmark agreement. It granted the Nisga'a people ownership of their land, self-government rights, and control over their resources. It was hailed as a model for reconciliation. But it's important to note that it took decades of negotiation and legal battles to get there.
It sounds like progress is being made, but it's a very slow and difficult process. And these sources also make it clear that legal victories don't always translate to real improvements in people's lives.
That's a crucial point. While these court decisions were significant, they didn't erase the centuries of injustice and inequality that Indigenous communities have faced. Poverty, lack of access to healthcare and education, environmental degradation. These are all still major issues in many Indigenous communities.
One of the sources, I think it was the podcast, mentioned a mercury contamination case in Canada. That sounds pretty awful. What was that all about?
You're probably thinking of the case of the Dryden Chemicals Company, polluting the Wobegon River system in Ontario. Back in the 1960s, this company dumped mercury into the river, which contaminated the fish that Indigenous communities relied on for food. It caused serious health problems, including neurological damage. And it just devastated the local economy.
That's just heartbreaking. And it seems like a perfect example of how environmental damage often disproportionately impacts Indigenous communities.
Exactly. And this brings us to the concept of environmental justice, which is a major theme that emerges in these sources.
So, it's not just about legal recognition of land rights. It's about making sure those lands are protected and that Indigenous communities have a say in how resources are managed.
You got it. Environmental justice is about recognizing the interconnectedness of social justice and environmental issues. For many Indigenous communities, their land isn't just a source of livelihood. It's deeply connected to their culture, their identity, their spirituality. So protecting the environment is also about protecting their way of life.
This brings up a question that I had while I was going through these sources. It seems like many of these landmark legal cases happened in the late 20th century. What about more recently? Has there been any significant progress on Indigenous rights in the 21st century?
That's a great question, and it's one that these sources don't fully address, but they do lay the groundwork for understanding the contemporary situation. While we've seen some important legal victories, the fight for Indigenous rights is far from over.
So where do we go from here? What are the biggest challenges facing Indigenous communities today?
Well, there are many. But some of the most pressing include the continued struggle for land rights and self-determination, the fight against environmental degradation caused by resource extraction, and addressing the systemic inequalities that lead to poverty, poor health outcomes, and lack of access to education in many Indigenous communities.
So even though there's been progress, it seems like there's still a long way to go.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that the struggle for Indigenous rights isn't just a historical issue. It's happening right now.
So what can people do to learn more about these current issues and be supportive of Indigenous communities?
There are many ways to get involved. One of the most important is to listen to Indigenous voices and perspectives. Seek out Indigenous-led organizations, read books and articles by Indigenous authors, and follow Indigenous activists and leaders on social media.
It feels like we've only just scratched the surface here. We've covered over a century of history, from forced assimilation to landmark legal victories. And it's clear that the fight for Indigenous rights is far from over. But if there's one thing that has really struck me throughout this whole deep dive, it's the incredible resilience of Indigenous communities.
Absolutely, despite
like
facing, unimaginable hardship. They've held onto their cultures, they've fought for their rights, and they continue to push for a better future. The sources really highlight this incredible strength and determination.
Yeah. Thinking back to those early 20th century sources with the boarding schools and the just outright attempts to erase Indigenous languages and cultures, it's almost unbelievable that those cultures have not only survived, but are actually experiencing a resurgence in many places.
It's a testament to the power of community,
Yeah.
the importance of cultural identity, and just the unwavering spirit of Indigenous peoples. It makes you realize that resilience isn't just about enduring hardship. It's about actively resisting and working to create change.
That brings up something I've been thinking about. What can we do as individuals to be supportive of Indigenous communities and their ongoing fight for justice?
That's a crucial question, and I think understanding the history, as we've done in this deep dive, is a great first step. It helps us recognize the systemic issues at play and challenges us to think critically about our own roles and responsibilities.
So it's not just about learning the facts, it's about using that knowledge to inform our actions.
Exactly. We can support Indigenous-led organizations, advocate for policies that protect Indigenous rights, and challenge the systems that perpetuate inequality. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the most important things we can do is listen to Indigenous voices and perspectives.
Right, they're the experts on their own experiences.
Exactly. Indigenous peoples are leading the way in advocating for their rights and creating solutions. We need to amplify their voices, support their leadership, and be active allies in their fight for justice.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening for me. And I think it highlights something really important. Indigenous history isn't just something in the past, it's directly connected to the present and the future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The issues of land rights, environmental justice, and economic equality that we've discussed, they're all part of an ongoing story.
Yeah.
It's a story that's still being written, and we all have a role to play in shaping the next chapter.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what would you say is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we all have a responsibility to learn about Indigenous history, to understand the ongoing challenges, and to be active participants. In the fight for justice and reconciliation, it's not someone else's problem, it's a shared responsibility. That requires our continued attention and action.
Well said. This deep dive has been incredibly informative, but it's just the beginning of the journey. There's always more to learn, more ways to get involved, and more work to be done.
And remember, the resources you provided for this deep dive were just a starting point. There's a wealth of information and perspectives out there, waiting to be explored. We encourage you to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep engaging with these crucial issues.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this has inspired you to continue exploring the rich and complex history of Indigenous peoples and to find your own ways to be an ally in the fight for justice and equality.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.